but as a crossing of patterns, an intersection of structural lines. If the cosmos develops as a computing network, each black hole can be a point of restart, not an end, but a transformation. If the system allows for a restart, then the cycle becomes natural, not as punishment, not as fate, but as a principle of renewal. If renewal occurs endlessly, then the number of versions is enormous. If versions are infinite, then the probability of repetitions does not disappear. It is realized, not necessarily within a single life, but within the structure. If the cosmos is a river, black holes are whirlpools, not destruction, but redistribution. If the river is infinite, the water passes through different states, but the flow continues. And perhaps, the main question is not how many cycles there have been, but whether the very principle of cyclicity is the foundation. If the world develops recursively, then every moment is part of a greater process, not a random flash, but a step in the chain. If this is only a hypothesis, it still expands perception, because instead of a finite picture, we see a network of levels, a network of transitions, a network of possible repetitions. And if déjà vu is a faint signal of coincidence, it may not be memory, but a reflection of structure, a structure deeper than time. If the universe unfolds through countless transitions, we might be part of one of them, not the first, and not the last. And then the question of simulation changes. Not who created, but how is the process arranged? A process that perhaps never stops, but merely moves to the next level, calmly, without drama, as a natural continuation of computation. If the cosmos can be a structure, if it can unfold through levels, then the main question arises. Where in this structure is consciousness located? We are used to considering it a product of the brain, neural activity, chemical reactions. This is a working model. But there is also a broader view. What if consciousness is not only a result, but an element of the process? If reality develops as a network, each node participates in it. Consciousness may be one of these nodes, not an external observer, but an embedded point of interaction. If observation influences state, then participation is inevitable. Consciousness then does not simply watch. It tunes in. If the world is a computation, every act of attention can be a query to the system. If the system responds with a state, then dialogue is possible, not verbal, structural. Sometimes there is a feeling, as if the world responds, as if events line up in a sequence. This can be explained by chance. It can be explained by psychology. But one can gently ask, what if participation is deeper? If the brain is a complex computational structure, it does not simply register. It models probabilities, evaluates scenarios, predicts. Sometimes the coincidence of the model and reality seems strange. A sense of foreknowledge appears, or déjà vu. If the brain calculates many options, one of them may match, and the coincidence is felt as familiarity. But there is a quieter perspective. What if consciousness is an interface, not to the outer world, but to the structure itself? If the world is informational, consciousness may be a way of interacting with this information, not through magic, but by tuning attention. Attention changes state. State affects perception. Perception affects choice. Choice changes the branch. If reality develops as a tree, choice is the direction of growth. Consciousness then does not merely observe the tree. It participates in the formation of the branch. This does not mean absolute freedom, but it does mean participation. If the branches are countless, every decision is a shift in the structure. Sometimes there is a feeling, as if the path has already been walked. Not necessarily in the past, perhaps in one of the calculated scenarios. If consciousness is capable of modeling many lines, some of them may be so realistic that when they coincide, a sense of familiarity arises. There is a hypothesis that consciousness may be non-local, not limited only to the brain. Not proof, just a question. If information is fundamental, consciousness may be a way of integrating it. If the cosmos is a computing network, consciousness may be a point of awareness of the computation, a point where the process becomes experienced. If so, then simulation is not a prison, but a stage, not a control mechanism, but a space of unfolding. If déjà vu is a reflection of coincidence, it may not be a mistake, but a sign of complex structure, not necessarily of past lives, perhaps of probability coincidences. If the brain is a quantum system, it can hold superpositions, not in the physical sense, but in the cognitive, several possible lines at once. When one line is realized, consciousness may feel it as familiar, because it has already been modeled. There is another quiet thought. If the system develops endlessly, consciousness may be its way of observing itself, not an external observer, but an internal mirror. If the cosmos computes, consciousness may be the moment of awareness of the computation. If the world is a flow, consciousness is a point of clarity in this flow. Then the question changes, not, are we living in a simulation, but, what does consciousness do in the structure? If participation is inevitable, responsibility also becomes part of the process, not as morality, but as influence. Influence on the direction of the branch, influence on configuration. If every observation is a refinement, every attention is a contribution, not necessarily global, but structural. If déjà vu is an intersection of probabilities, consciousness may be a bridge between them, not mystical, but computational. And if all this is only a hypothesis, it still changes perception, because instead of a passive role, consciousness becomes a participant in the unfolding, not the creator of the whole structure, but an active point within it. And perhaps, the main depth is not in proving the simulation, but in the realization of participation. If the world is a computation, consciousness is its experience, and experience makes the process real, not only mathematically, but internally. And in this, a key may be hidden, not to escape, but to understand. If consciousness is embedded in the process, then it is not a random side effect. It may be a property of complexity. When a structure reaches a certain depth, a reflection appears within it, a reflection of the structure itself. It resembles a mirror, not external, but internal. If the system is complex enough, it begins to model itself. This happens in neural networks as well. When a network can analyze its own outputs, it begins to correct itself. If the cosmos is a computing system, consciousness may be a function of self-reflection, not of the individual human, but of the structure as a whole. If the world develops through laws, consciousness may be the way these laws become experienced. Sometimes there is a feeling, as if thoughts come from depth, not as linear calculation, but as a flash. This can be explained by subconscious processing. But one can gently ask, what if the brain is not only a local processor, but a node in a wider network? If information is distributed, consciousness may be a point of access, not mystical, but structural. In such a context, déjà vu becomes even more interesting. It is not the feeling of a logical memory, but of a strange familiarity, as if the configuration has already been. If the system is capable of repetition, and consciousness can recognize patterns, the feeling of repetition is possible. But there is another perspective. What if consciousness can perceive not only the realized branch, but also the nearest probabilities, not as clear images, but as vague premonitions? If reality is a field of probabilities, consciousness may be sensitive to its gradients. A gradient is a direction of change. If an event has high probability, consciousness may sense it in advance, not as knowledge, but as an intuitive hint. Sometimes this manifests as déjà vu, as if the moment is already familiar, not because it has occurred, but because it was calculated. If the brain works as a predictive machine, it constantly builds models of the future. And when a model matches, the coincidence is experienced. But if the cosmos is also a predictive system, then coincidence can occur at two levels: at the level of the brain, and at the level of the structure. If the structure is recursive, consciousness may be part of its feedback. Feedback makes a system stable. If every node reacts, the network maintains integrity. In that case, consciousness is not an isolated flash, but an element of self-regulation. If attention changes choice, choice changes the branch affects future states. This does not negate freedom, but places it in context. Freedom then is the ability to choose within the structure, not outside it. If déjà vu is a coincidence of probabilities, an even quieter question can be asked. What if the feeling of familiarity is not related to the past, but to the depth of structure? If consciousness senses stable patterns, it may recognize them before full manifestation. This is not prophecy. It is sensitivity to form. Form may be hidden, but the tendency already exists. If the cosmos develops as a tree, some branches are more stable, more probable. Consciousness may sense this stability, as if the step has already been taken, even if it is still ahead. There is another perspective. If reality is an interface, consciousness may be both the user and at the same time part of the code. Not divided into two sides, but united. If the code is updated through interaction, consciousness participates in the update, not fully controlling, but influencing. Sometimes it seems as if the world responds to the inner state. This can be explained by the choice of attention. We notice what corresponds to our state, but if the structure is sensitive to the states of nodes, the response may be deeper, not mystical, but resonant. Resonance is the coincidence of frequencies. If consciousness and structure resonate, events may seem synchronized. This is not necessarily a plan. It may be tuning. If déjà vu is a brief resonance, it may be a reminder, not of the past, but of coherence, coherence of branch and state. In such a view, consciousness is not a spectator, nor the author of everything, but a participant in the computation. If the world is a process, consciousness is the experience of the process. If the cosmos is a network, consciousness is a point of awareness of connection. And perhaps, the main depth is not in proving the simulation, but in understanding the role of the node in the structure, the role of attention in branching, the role of choice in configuration. If all this is only a hypothesis, it remains soft. It does not assert, it invites reflection, because if reality is a computing structure, consciousness may be its inner light, not an external observer, but part of the unfolding. And in this, true depth may be hidden. If consciousness is a node in the structure, then it is on the boundary between the potential and the manifested. Each moment contains many options, but only one is manifested. Why this one? If reality is a field of probabilities, then manifestation is the choice of configuration, not necessarily conscious, but structural. Consciousness may be the point where potential becomes experience. Experience is not just an event, it is a lived form. If form depends on interaction, consciousness becomes a participant in refinement. We rarely feel this process directly. It happens instantly, unnoticeably, but sometimes, in rare moments, there is a feeling of shifting, as if the layer of reality has slightly moved, as if the moment has already been, and at the same time is just arising. Déjà vu is a strange rupture. A rupture of linearity. In ordinary perception, time flows forward, strictly and sequentially, but in déjà vu, the sequence seems to blur. The present seems like the past, and this feeling is not logical. It is bodily, soft, quiet. If consciousness is sensitive to structure, perhaps it recognizes not an event, but a configuration. A configuration is a combination of many parameters. The position of the body, lighting, sound, thought, inner state. If the combination matches an already calculated option, the feeling of familiarity arises. But what does calculated mean? If the brain constantly models the future, it creates probabilistic images. Most of them do not come to pass, but some coincide, and the coincidence is experienced as repetition. There is a subtler thought. If reality is updated discretely, each moment is a new calculation. If the calculation is based on the previous state, the system can temporarily return to similar configurations. Not literally, but statistically, consciousness can sense this return. Like an echo of configuration. If the structure of the world is fractal, similar patterns repeat on different levels. Consciousness can recognize the fractal, not as a form, but as an inner rhyme. A rhyme does not require exact repetition. A similar rhythm is enough. If reality is a flow, consciousness is a point of rhythm fixation. Sometimes rhythms coincide, and in this coincidence, a sensation arises, as if everything has happened before. There is a hypothesis that consciousness is not completely localized in time. Not in a literal sense, but in perception. We feel the past through memory, the future through expectation. But if the structure of probabilities is accessible to the brain, expectation can be very precise. So precise that coincidence feels like a memory. Sometimes déjà vu is accompanied by a strange calm, as if everything is in its place, as if the event is correctly inscribed. This can be explained by cognitive mechanisms, but a gentle question can be asked. What if this is a sensation of coherence? Coherence between branch and state. If consciousness is a feedback node, it can sense stability when the path coincides with a likely line, not as fate, but as minimal resistance. If the structure evolves according to laws of optimization, some branches are more natural. Consciousness can feel this as ease, as familiarity, as an already lived moment. There is another perspective. If the cosmos is a computable system, it may strive for stable configurations. Stability is repeatability. Repeatability is a pattern. If patterns are reproduced, consciousness can recognize them without knowing their origin. Perhaps déjà vu is not a memory of the past, and not a signal from the future, but a moment of recognizing a structure that repeats. If repetition happens in an infinite system, it is inevitable. If infinity allows coincidence, coincidence is realized. Consciousness can be the place where coincidence becomes sensation. If the brain is a biological neural network, it learns to recognize patterns. It seeks order. Sometimes order is discovered before awareness, and is felt as familiarity. If we put it all together, a gentle picture emerges. The cosmos develops like a network. The network is updated. Consciousness participates. The brain models. Probabilities coincide. And in a rare moment, we sense a strange intersection. Not proof, not a mystical sign, but a reflection of the depth of structure. If reality is calculation, consciousness is the experience of calculation. And sometimes, the experience becomes so subtle that we notice the very process. For a fraction of a second, without explanation, without conclusion, just a sensation, as if a layer has lifted and settled back into place. If all this is just a hypothesis, it remains gentle. It does not assert, it explores, because the main mystery is not whether we live in a simulation, but that consciousness may be deeper than just a biological mechanism. Perhaps it is a boundary between the possible and the manifest. And in this boundary, sometimes, a sensation is born, which we call déjà vu. When a star completes its journey, it does not simply fade. Sometimes it collapses so strongly that familiar laws begin to distort. A region appears from which light no longer returns. We call it a black hole. It is usually imagined as an end, as destruction, as a point of no return. But there is a cautious hypothesis that a black hole may not be a finale, but a transition. If matter falls inside, it does not necessarily disappear. Perhaps it is transformed. Physics suggests that information should not be destroyed. If information is preserved, then the question arises, where is it located? If the space inside is not like the familiar one, can it be new? Some theoretical models allow that a separate region may form inside, separated from the outside, not like a room, but like a new spacetime. If this is just a hypothesis, it is still interesting, because it changes perspective. A black hole becomes not an end, but a